Hi everybody, I'm Billy, and this is Antioch, Chapter 27, 135ers. Antioch's stonemasons completed the wall at the end of summer, less than a year after they started. Before the wall's ends met, the city hadn't seen a Bowron in months. Everyone felt it was the calm before the storm, that an army of smoking devils was out there roaming the countryside, gathering in number, and that it was only a matter of time before the siege. Michael had rung the church bell for months without an answer. It wasn't until the wall was finished that he was finally able to relax. He stood opposite Harold in the graveyard, each wearing the brown wool pants and white linen shirts of the fellowship. They saluted one another with their weapons, Michael with a two-handed hardwood practice sword, Harold with a skinny apple branch, holding his wolf's head shield in his other hand. A dead leaf twirled by on the gentle autumn breeze. Jacob sat watching them from the stump by the forge. His apprentice, Ditch, sat next to him. Since the sailors' other responsibilities, the patrol and defense of the city, had basically come to an end with the wall, Ditch was taking the initiative to learn a trade. Jacob flashed him a quick grin. "Michael's got him this time," Ditch said. "No way. Harold's too good." Harold stalked, almost in a crouch, swaying in and out of the wooden sword's range. Michael stood upright, poised to strike with power. Harold kept trying to bait out an attack. He'd faked to go in, and then he leapt back. Michael wasn't falling for it. Then, suddenly, Harold swept by and tapped Michael on the inside of the thigh with the branch. Happily out of range again, he said, "Touch point!" So taken by surprise, Michael had barely moved to respond. He groaned and lowered his sword. "What was that?" Harold tapped his own leg on the same spot. "There's a bloodline through here. Draw an edge across it, and the fight's over." "Ah, of course, I know the one." Michael took position and saluted. "Again." Ditch nudged Jacob. "Harold knows what's up." "Pwah! Michael's just taking it easy on him. He doesn't want to hurt him, that's all." Ditch laughed. "Whatever, man. Harold's going to school him all day. Watch." Jacob frowned at Ditch, and then focused in on the action, shifting and ducking with his fists up, as if he was one of the combatants. Harold swayed back and forth out of range again, and then head-faked Michael into a cautious swing. Whoosh! The king's man spun aside under his shield and came to a graceful stop with the tip of his apple branch poked into Michael's ribs near the armpit. "Touch point!" Michael acknowledged the hit. "Ah, and from there to the heart. You're a difficult target with this fencing of yours, Harold." Harold bowed. "That's gracious to say. Such is the fencer's endeavor. Every attack should be coupled with defense. In fact, that's where the name of the art comes from, the word defense. Is that right?" "Quite." Harold whipped and brandished his apple branch athletically. "A true fencer is the deceiver in a quarrel. He seeks first to avoid the point." "Ah." Over on the stump, Ditch nudged Jacob again, jutting out his chin, and said, "What's up?" Jacob laughed. "You're smug." Ditch laughed too. "It's all that feinting Harold does, man. Michael's used to fighting stuff that comes right at him. He doesn't know what Harold's going to do." Jacob nodded, recollecting past repairs to the sleeve. "That's true." "Michael's all about that one big shot, too. In the gym, we used to call that head hunting. Like when a guy's got a good right hand, but that's all he throws, always going for the KO. You're a lot easier to read if you only got one move." Ditch sighed. "Man, I miss getting in a good fight." Jacob paused at the mention of head hunting. "You miss fighting?" "Yeah, it's fun, when you're good at it and the other guy's good at it. Watching a good fight's fun, training's fun. I miss all that." "But you were a slave." "Huh?" "Captain told me you were a pit slave overseas." Captain had been trying to generate a little sympathy for Ditch, in order to help him get the apprenticeship. He'd also inferred that Ditch's tattoos were a type of branding, like the DB Davies put on cattle. "What was it he said?" "He said you've been forced into a blood sport for the amusement of your unscrupulous masters." "Man, pit slave's the gym's name. We got paid to fight." "Whatever for?" "'Cause people like watching these." Ditch made fists, bit his lip, and sneered at the awesomeness. "Who'd pay to see those, hey? Fist fighting's for savages and naughty children." "Whatever, man. This is you." Ditch opened his eyes wide and mocked Jacob's earlier shifting and ducking with his fists up, as if he was one of the combatants, only goofier. Jacob laughed. "I don't do that." "Yeah, you do. Everybody likes a good fight. Look at you out here watching these two." Michael and Harold guarded, turned, and parried, dodged, spun, and thrust. Jacob said, "Sure, but they're not trying to hurt each other." "We didn't fight to hurt the other guy, man. It wasn't just for the money either. It's about competition, getting better, showing everybody what you can do. For a fighter, that's totally worth a bloody nose or whatever. Even if we hated each other, A lot of times after a fight, we'd get this mad respect for the other guy because he stepped up. Some of my best friends were guys that smashed my face. Jacob thought about it, fighting for the joy of it, not to make war or to kill. It didn't exactly fit the Fellowship's definition of violence, to which they were religiously opposed, and Jacob thought it brought up some interesting questions. Then he started thinking about how much had changed over the last year. Michael's in brown and whites, for God's sake. That alone was a shocker. Despite the horrors of the plague, the sailors were causing a cultural revolution. The Fellowship devoured art, literature, and philosophy from overseas. Stout farmers braved a life outside of the wall to bring in crops to trade for technology. And as far as any of them knew for sure, they were the only people in the world. Not only had the Bowron and the infections disappeared months before, there hadn't been a stranger from any direction in just as long. Ditch said, "It's cool to see how styles match up. What's Michael's called?" "What?" "You know, Harold's got that fencing, right? What's the name of Michael's fighting style?" "Oh, I think it's called cutting things in half." "For real?" Jacob laughed. "No, I don't know that it's got a name. John taught him how to use the way with a sword. He's terribly strong. Michael can't really take a swing at Harold, not even with that wood waster. He'd break him through the shield." Ditch believed it. "Power's no joke. Sometimes headhunting's fine if you got enough swat. Seen it plenty of times. Guys losing a fight, then blow! Out of nowhere, you know, like a bolt out of the balloon. It's all over." He waved his arms in the traditional fashion of an old-world referee stopping a bout. Jacob didn't understand any of that. "Hey?" Ditch went back to watching the swordplay, wistfully missing his old career. Before the fall, he'd been 36, and mostly in retirement, coaching. His injuries had accumulated, and prize fighting was a young man's sport. But at 38, with his body carved into its 20s again, and his competitive spirit at its peak, it was instead the entire fight game that had been retired. "Whatever, man." Ditch pointed at Michael and Harold. "That's what it's all about, right there. You get in there, get a good sparring partner, and just make each other better. That's the best part." Jacob scoffed. "Not if your sparring partner flits about like a nesting tit with a wee twig, chirping it up. Touch point, touch point. I don't see how that's making Michael any better at anything. He's a devil slayer, not a dancer." Ditch laughed. "What do you want him to do?" Jacob held up his meaty blacksmith's fist. "Stand strong. Go blow for blow. Then we'd see who's the better man, hey?" Ditch rolled his eyes. One minute Jacob was saying fist fighting's for savages and naughty children, and the next he wanted Harold to stand in the pocket with Michael and get his clock cleaned. There was too much wrong in there to argue with all of it. "Look, Michael's your boy, so you don't like seeing him lose, but only bombs go in to trade punches. Harold fights smart. Take that stuff he's saying about the bloodline or whatever. That's straight up physiology, man. He's talking about the femoral artery. You kick a guy there, put some hard shin on it, you can shut down his footwork and get a real advantage. Inside leg kicks win fights." Ditch said the last as a detached aphorism with a shrug. It was something he'd often said when coaching in order to discourage fighters from headhunting. He smiled, remembering calling it out from the corner. "Inside leg kicks win fights! Inside leg kicks win fights!" He could almost feel the canvas and almost hear the cheering crowd. Jacob said, "If you're going to kick a man there, why not just kick him in the peaches?" Ditch paused. Then he leaned forward and started cackling with his rapid-fire, raucous laughter, like a hyena in a henhouse. It distracted Michael and gave Harold an opening. "Touch point! God's mercy!" Ditch giggled through an explanation about the fight business for Jacob. "'Cause that's against the rules, man. In the street, yeah, kick them there all day, but nobody's going to pay to see a couple guys busting each other in the balls." Jacob laughed along with him. A sun-bleached skeleton was tangled in the thorn bushes to the west. Its tattered clothing had outlasted its flesh. Once it had been the smoke's instrument of death, a dreaded Bowron, but those only consumed themselves. Over time, its nature and exposure had worn it too spare even to pull itself free. John's Pinto passed the skeleton coming in toward Antioch. The rider slowed to have a look. Under a hooded cloak, he wore a sleek black uniform with a silver cross threaded into the chest. A rapier hung from his hip. He spurred the horse on. The closer he came to the wall, the larger it looked. He trotted up next to its 18-foot height and realized he wouldn't be able to jump it even if he stood on Sarah's back. He'd caused much dismay by naming the horse that. He'd have to find another way in. It took him an hour to ride around the entire town. There wasn't a single tree close enough to help him over, and the 4 gates, north, south, east, and west, were each as unscalable as the rest. Each also had a cord leading up above to a bell. He guessed those were for ringing to get in, but he didn't want to announce his presence like that. Not until he knew for sure if that old rascal Abraham was in there. He rode to the orchard in the north and got down to share some apples with his horse and to think. It was in the same season of the year before that he'd first come to Antioch after losing his father and sister to the plague. He was that year older, taller, and thicker, and, hidden in the shadows of his hood, Daniel's eyes had lost some of their froggishness. The north gate would be the closest to the cauldron, where he wanted to go first. He trusted Fergus. All he had to do was figure out a way to get in. So, he sat there until dusk, eating apples, feeding apples to Sarah, and staring at the wall without a clue. He'd almost given up and was about to ring the bell when a marble-mouthed voice startled him from behind. "Are you going in?" Daniel spun to his feet in a whirl of cloak and silver, his rapier drawn before he'd seen or asked who it was. Barabbas backed up, eyes wide and a shade between blue and amber. A sparse scraggle of a beard was coming in around his neck, and didn't hide his teeth yet. From far away, and in the fading light, they could have been boys of the same age, one groomed in a uniform and the other wild in furs. Daniel lowered his sword and frowned. "What do you want, Gunder?" Barabbas sat down, scratched, and thought for a moment. "I want my own pride. I want to sit in the tree." Daniel turned away disdainfully, sheathing his elegant weapon. "Go sit in a tree, then. I don't have time for a Gunder like you. I'm on an important mission." While Barabbas contemplated what would happen if he tried to sit in Apoc's tree, Daniel stared at the wall and recalled those first words. "Are you going in?" "Gunder, do you know how to get into the city?" "Yes." Daniel waited. Then he sighed. Then he lost patience and said, "How?" Barabbas queered at him. Having already dissociated that question from the last, he wondered what the little man meant by it. It was such a broad thing to ask. How? 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 How what? "Fwah! How do I get inside?" Barabbas was shocked. "He's listening out loud." "Jump over the wall." Daniel groaned. "I can't jump over that wall. It's too high for me." "Ring the bell." "I can't do that either." "Can't ring a bell? Are you Dukist?" "What? No, I don't even know what that means. Stupid Gunders and their stupid words that don't mean anything. I'll stop to figure it out on my own." Daniel settled his gaze on the wall again, as though it was a masterful opponent in a game of strategy. Barabbas was bamboozled. The little man wasn't Dukist, but couldn't ring a bell or jump over the wall. It was a difficult set of problems. How is he going to get in? How? How? Oh, the little man might know. How are you going to get inside? Daniel threw his hands up and shouted all of his words into one. "Ah, stupid gunner, get away from me!" Barabbas hissed and cut out of there in a scramble. He stopped 3 trees down, peering back. "The little man is dangerous." Daniel gave up. He'd just have to ring the bell and take his chances. If Abraham comes, there's going to be a fight, and I'm ready for it. He took up Sarah's reins and led her to the gate. Then, right when he was about to pull the cord, he got an idea. "Psst! Gunner!" From back where he'd stayed watching, Barabbas said, "What?" "Come jump over the wall and open the door for me." There was a pause. Then, "Okay." Barabbas shot out of the trees, kicking up leaves, vaulted into one step off the wall, and then easily over the top. He landed with a soft thump on the other side. The guardhouse and the watch platform were empty. He had the gate unbarred and opened in a minute. Daniel walked his horse through and said, "Thanks," in passing. Barabbas scratched and waved. Neither of them considered closing the gate. Daniel left Sarah by the smokehouse and crept like an assassin toward the kitchen. The doorway glowed in the darkening night. He pulled his hood back and listened. Fergus was talking inside. "Whoo-hoo! Then our little pixies go to work and scream us up a batch of good dough for the baking." "Grandpa, I'm not a dummy. There's no wizards or pixies." Daniel frowned, guessing that was one of Davy's boys. Fergus said, "Oh ho! There's not, is there? Well, what do you think makes the bread rise, then? Not a dummy." "God? He's the one that makes the pixies, isn't he? Put some good lungs on them, too. Just listen. Help me! Help me!" "Oh, no. Did you hear that? Poor devils." The little boy laughed. "That was you, Grandpa." Fergus chuckled. As they spooned yeast into the dough bowls to bloom, the little boy asked, "Grandpa, is there really magic?" He didn't think of hospital as magic, of course. He'd been around that all his life, just like everyone else in the fellowship. Fergus said, "Sure there is. Here, let me show you some. Give us a hug." Daniel guessed from the following silence that they were hugging, and thought he heard Fergus whisper something. Then the little boy said, I love you too, Grandpa. Daniel felt less then like he was being cautious, and more like he was spying. He stepped into the kitchen and knocked on the door. When they looked up, he raised a black-gloved finger to his lips and went, "Shh." Fergus beamed at him and exclaimed, "Daniel!" as loud as anything. Daniel's eyes bulged and he started waving frantically. "Shh!" Fergus laughed, went over and embraced him. "What are you doing, boy? You're hissing like Barabbas." "Is Abraham around?" "What? No! No one's seen hide nor hair of him since the lot of you left. I'm so glad to see you." Daniel exhaled and got another hug. The little boy stared up at him from behind the butcher table, not placing the black-clad stranger as the one who'd punched and spat on his father a year before, but getting a bad feeling from him all the same. Fergus said, "Where's John?" "He's back in Golgotha." Fergus realized then that Golgotha had survived, and that other towns might have survived as well. He thought about what a dangerous trip it must have been for Daniel. "What are you doing here?" "I'm on a secret mission. I'm here to get a book from the church." Fergus frowned. "Does John know where you are?" Daniel paused long enough to reveal the truth. Then he lied. "He's the one that sent me." Fergus let it go. Daniel was safe right then, which was the most important thing. Instead of confronting him for the lie, Fergus said, "You must be starving. Let me make you something to eat." Daniel ate there in the kitchen, and then out in the common room too, which was quiet compared to the time he'd spent there, but much busier than when Michael's bell used to ring. He answered questions from all sides wherever he went. Margot squealed, "Ooh!" hugged him, and asked about John. Everyone asked about Bowron. Harold was there, desperate to know if any king's men had made it to Golgotha, and Captain sat smoking and listening. Daniel told that John was fine, and sent everyone reeling with the news that they'd seen neither a Bowron nor a king's soldier the whole year. There were hands on heads across the room, and a general discussion about what it all meant. Daniel removed himself from it. He'd found something more important. Sarah, the girl. She was more beautiful than he remembered. Daniel offered her a chair. She was happy to sit with him and to talk, ready to catch up like old friends. She didn't ask many questions, though, and kept on and on about some boy named Edward, who Daniel didn't want to hear about. Daniel strove to impress her. "I won't be here for long. I've got a big job to do back in Golgotha. I'll be leaving soon." "Wow, that's neat. Edward's got a big job, too. He works the church's stable for Michael. He was doing it even before the wall was finished. Andolyn said it was very brave of him to go out there every day through the graveyard, and she's the bravest person I know, so that's really saying something." Edward. "I've been riding and camping by myself for 2 weeks. I didn't have a wall." Sarah gasped and covered her mouth. "You must be tired. Where are you going to sleep? I'm in your old room now. Andolyn and Biggs have mine. Ooh, I know. Maybe you could stay with Edward. I'm sure he'd let you. He's ever so generous." Edward again. Daniel pointed at himself. "I'm on a secret mission." "Really? What is it?" Sarah loved a good secret. Daniel divulged it readily. "I'm here to get a book that will help us kill a devil in Golgotha. It's an evil rascal called a Gaffet. Everyone is depending on me." He puffed out his chest and made himself look important. "Wow, that is a big job. But at least you don't have any Bowron there, like you said. Nothing could be worse than them. You can be thankful for that no matter what devils you've got." Sarah nodded wisely, and then started thinking about Edward. Daniel was annoyed. The conversation was not going as planned. It was hard for him, but he didn't care for any more chit-chat, so he got right to the point. "I'm not just here for a book, Sarah. I came all this way for you, to take you back with me. We're supposed to get married, remember?" Her mouth fell open. The room began to listen. Daniel said, "What's wrong?" Sarah squirmed. "Ooh, Daniel, wow, that wasn't, ugh." Aware of the silence around them, she lowered her voice. "I'm 17. You're 13. 14." He didn't know why she was being so stupid. He was a year older, too. Sarah froze. Then she rose slowly out of her chair. "I just remembered. I have to go upstairs." She turned her back on him and scooted away, a straight line of uncomfortable girl. Daniel didn't understand it all. Recalling some advice Judas had given him, he stood up and shouted, "I named my horse after you!" as if that was delightful and would bring her right back. Sarah accelerated, up and out of sight onto the second floor's landing. Daniel dropped his hands to his sides, confused, and stayed that way for a long time, watching that spot on the stairs. Everyone else drew together, cringing and whispering, their greater concerns briefly muted in that moment of humiliating rejection. Then Daniel overheard their conversations. The whispers revealed that Sarah had been courting Edward for some time, that Fergus had been baking his wicked apple pies for them left and right, and that she hadn't ever shown much interest in John's nephew. Captain strolled over to Fergus, blew smoke, and said low, "Boy's named a horse after your daughter." Fergus nodded sadly and reached out for the pipe. "I guess he has." "Is that something you do around here?" "No." Seems a dubious compliment to pay a young lady." Captain tapped himself on the nose. "Still, better than a boat, I suppose." Daniel slumped into his chair and stared at his empty plate, just beginning to feel like a fool. Then he covered his face. He knew it was coming, and he couldn't stop it. He wept in front of everyone. The church door opened, and Michael looked up from the round table, where he wrote by the hearthlight and a candle. He'd been translating script into Moroan every evening after Andolin left. Pillars of books surrounded him on the floor, twice the number that originally came out of the back room. They'd been bringing up more from Ezekiel's tomb. Harold walked in out of the night with Daniel, whom Michael didn't recognize right away in that black and silver uniform. Harold said, "This boy has just arrived from Golgotha. He says he knows you." Daniel frowned at the introduction. Then Michael knew who he was. "Daniel!" He hurried over to take his hand, asking right away about John. Daniel liked that much better, and told everything as he had at the cauldron. Michael darkened almost immediately, listening to the rest with cold scrutiny. When Daniel finished, Michael said, "Harold, would you mind giving us a moment alone?" Harold did mind. He wanted to know what Michael was going to do. He wanted to explore beyond the wall and to find out if anyone in the north had survived. But he also had a soldier's respect for authority, and Michael was the Lord of Antioch. Harold said, "Certainly. I'll just take a few ledgers with me to practice the script." Michael nodded, keeping a hard look on Daniel, who was starting to get nervous. Harold collected his things and closed the door as he left. As soon as they were alone, Michael said, "You're lying." "No, I'm not. Don't lie to me. John would never have sent you all that way by yourself. Tell me the truth." Daniel paused, about to lie again, but Michael's glowering disapproval frightened him. "Okay, you're right. He didn't send me." "Does he know where you are?" "No, I didn't tell him, but—" "He must be beside himself! Do you have any idea what you've done?" "No! No, of course you don't! How could you, you careless child!" Michael radiated anger and disappointment. He could only hope John hadn't left his post to look for Daniel. No, John wouldn't do that. Daniel felt about to cry again. "Not in front of Michael. Please. No." The whole trip was turning out to be horrible. "I'm going back. He just really needs that book. I was afraid he'd come after me. That's why I didn't tell him where I—" "Why would you be afraid of John? What's happened between the two of you?" "No, that's not what I meant. I was afraid to tell him because I know he can't leave Golgotha, and he wouldn't have let me go if I asked. I heard him talking to Fagin about the book, but they couldn't come to get it because of the smoke, so I came to get it for them." It didn't sound like the whole story, but Michael saw some sense in it. If there was something vital in that book, if they did need it in Golgotha, Daniel would have been the only one capable of coming after it, provided he'd learned anything from his master. "You can open the way?" Daniel said, "Yes," though he often wished he couldn't. "Well, that's something at least. You weren't completely defenseless. Can you pull?" That skill was more complicated. He doubted Daniel could do it. Andolin, though a rapid study, was still in the practicing stages of it. Daniel looked away, wiping tears out of his eyes. Michael saw the truth. "It's more difficult to do for someone else than it is to do for yourself, isn't it?" The boy choked up. Michael was disgusted. "Are you crying? Stop that!" "I can't! It's my stupid path! I cry all the time now! I hate it!" Daniel hid his face and did everything he could to stop. Then he cried even more because it didn't matter. He'd already looked like a fool in front of everyone. Michael paused, understanding. A path could be strong and difficult to control for a long time after awakening, especially so without diligent practice. He'd forgotten about that because Andolin's was so unusually calm. "What is it? Some kind of sadness?" Daniel sniffled into his elbow. "Sorrow." Michael pitied him with a sigh. It wasn't hard to guess why Daniel would have a path like that. And, being so young, he would grow into a man under a cloud of its influence. "Don't look at me like that. It's not my fault." "I know. Sit down." Michael motioned to a chair at the table and went to one of his pillars of books. He lifted 5 off the top, set them aside to preserve the order, and then picked up 2 more, one in each hand. "So, You've got a gaffet in Golgotha, do you? Yes, sir. Michael nodded. It's always something. I have this one copied into Marowan as well. You'll be able to read it on your way back, unless John's taught you the script, of course. Then I'd prefer to hold on to the translation. No, he hasn't taught me, but I can't read Marowan either, so it doesn't matter. Again Michael pitied him. He put the book of script in front of Daniel and returned the other to its place. Ask him to. He taught me, you know. Michael went to a different stack, pulled out a different kind of book, and sat next to Daniel. I want you to take this one as well. It was the first thing I thought to translate when I started doing all of this. Have John read it to you. What is it? It's called The Six Beginnings, written by the saint Matthew. It's more than 100 years old now, but I found it to be a useful study on the nature of paths. It helped me to understand some of the things I went through with my own. Shall I read some to you? Okay. Michael flipped through to a specific passage. Here it is. Matthew says, Sadness is the noblest of these emotions, because it is through our own sadness that we understand each other's pain. Only one without sadness could ever truly be alone. The known paths of sadness are... Michael read on, and Daniel sat listening, not so sure this Matthew knew what he was talking about. Daniel felt both sad and alone, terribly, and all the time. But he was also glad Michael didn't seem to be angry with him anymore. Daniel spent that night in the church. Michael suggested he stay and rest for a few days, but Daniel said there was no time, that he needed to act. Michael remembered saying something similar to John once. The next morning, Michael left a note on the door so they could share a mediocre breakfast at the inn. Daniel didn't want to eat at the cauldron. Michael didn't argue with him about it. Their conversation was spare. Michael prodded the bad food, remembering the last time they'd eaten together. That had been a bittersweet affair for them all. He said, I know. What's the best thing in the kitchen, Daniel? Daniel said, Not this, without a trace of humor, and ate it anyway. Michael chuckled. Do you know, I think I'd like to send a letter to John. Could you stay long enough for me to write one? Okay. Maybe Grandpa won't be so mad that way. I'll get my horse up while you're at it. There won't be any need for that. I've the stable boy outfitting her as we speak. Michael smiled, happy to lessen Daniel's burden. Daniel paused, bug-eyed, having just taken a mouthful of salty eggs on toast. Edward was the stable boy. Daniel didn't want Edward saddling Sarah at all. Food blasted from his mouth as he shouted, Pwah! No thanks! I'll do that myself! He jumped out of his chair. Bethenford, who was coming over, cried, My word! What's that language for the breakfast table? Michael did something of the same. God's mercy! Go right ahead, then! Daniel had already run out of the inn's double doors. While Bethenford's common room recovered from the inappropriate outburst, Michael thought he remembered that Daniel might have just referred to John as Grandpa a moment before. He'd have to ask him about that later. By the time Daniel reached the stable, it was too late. The pinto was shoed, saddled, and brushed. He found the precious books in her pack, and some good food from the cauldron, too, which meant Edward had been through his things. Daniel burned with hatred. Edward walked out of the back. He was 17, tall and thin. Daniel was 3 years younger, but on his way to being a giant like Horace. They both weighed 135 pounds. Edward smiled at him. She's all yours. Then, just as he left the stable, just within earshot, he snickered. What's so funny? Edward paused and then turned around. There was a little too much challenge in the way Daniel had spoken. It's just that you named the horse Sarah. That's so stupid! He laughed, not necessarily trying to be mean, but genuinely amused. It was obvious he'd heard everything. Daniel was mortified. His large eyes started to water. I'm sorry, you're not going to cry, are you? That was Edward being mean. Daniel did cry. He followed his path to the source, ripped it up like a thorn bush, and let the wren fly. Then he grabbed Edward by the shirt and slammed him into the wall. It could have been Ares kicking the stall the way the whole stable shook. Bridles and tack trembled to fall, and a jar of shoe nails crashed to the floor. Edward blacked out for a split second, and then gasped from having the wind knocked out of him. He swatted and scratched to get away, but Daniel was too strong, impossibly strong. It seemed like an axe would have bounced off of him. Twisted with sadness and rage, tears spurting out of his ducts, Daniel had the expression of someone who was very, very sorry for being about to rip another person apart. Edward was terrified. A burlap sack of horseshoes dropped to the ground behind them. Clank. What are you doing, kid? Daniel turned around with that terrible face. It was Ditch, in a sweat from the forge. The pictures on his skin snaked out from under his tank top and dipped into the clefts of his muscles. Though small for a grown man, he was a beast next to these teenagers. Daniel shouted, "Go away, you stupid sailor!" and turned back to Edward, who was so firmly pinned he might as well have been impaled. Ditch nodded. "All right," promptly walked up and kicked Daniel between the legs from behind. It was beyond Daniel's ability to concentrate through the pain. He let go and doubled over in the dirt. Ditch said, "Get out of there, Ed," which Edward did, gladly. Ditch had heard Daniel was back in town. Guessing the kid was all pumped up on the way or whatever, like Michael, it didn't seem fair to let him stomp the stable boy. Ditch put himself between the two and said, "You want to fight? Fight me." Daniel wanted to do exactly that. He found his path again and tore it loose. It was the quickest recovery from a groin shot Ditch had ever seen. Daniel charged, the intentions plain on his face. "Let's see how you like it!" He brought his foot all the way back to Golgotha, ready to punt Ditch through the roof. Ditch almost laughed as he circled out of the way. Daniel flew past like he was jumping a hurdle. "Yeah, they always want to pay you back with the same," Ditch thought, strutting out into the open. He looked back over his shoulder, pretending to be thoroughly unimpressed. Daniel charged him again. Ditch circled out and smack! Slapped him in the face. It wasn't the hardest slap, but to Daniel it was worse than a low blow. It was more personal. Only his father had ever hit him in the face like that. He was too shocked to concentrate. The sudden loss of Rin's strength caused a weird shift in his momentum, and he dropped onto his hands and knees in the dirt again, crying. Ditch walked away. "Keep it up, kid. You're going to learn how to get hit, that's all." Ditch didn't want to hurt him. He wanted to break his spirit. He figured Daniel was already in tears, so it wouldn't be long before he gave up. Then he'd show him a little respect, and they'd all go get something to eat together and be friends. I might even make up with Fergus while I'm at it. It seemed like a good day to kill a feud. Edward cheered. "Yeah, give it to him, Ditch!" Daniel headed for Edward then, who shouted and ran for his life. Ditch outpaced them both like it was child's play. Hook tripped Daniel and sent him sprawling into the dirt on his face again. Walking away, he said, "Don't worry about Ed. I'm your problem." Daniel went berserk. His strength was useless. It didn't matter what he did. He couldn't lay a hand on either of them. Ditch was too fast, circling out of the way, slapping him, tripping him, and pushing him down over and over, all while Edward laughed and cheered. The dirt and tears turned into mud on Daniel's cheeks. Then he remembered his rapier. He drew it without a second thought, ready to kill that stupid sailor. Ditch's eyes narrowed. Playtime was over. He saw the weapon as a 3-foot reach advantage with a hard, sharp edge. He thought about backing off, that it might be smart, but instead decided to teach that clumsy kid a lesson about fighting dirty. Unfortunately, Daniel wasn't clumsy with his sword. He feinted once, spun, and shoved it up to the hilt through the sailor's lung. Then he ripped it out and walked away, paying Ditch back with a look. Ditch was stunned. He couldn't believe it. The breath hitched in his chest, and he put his hand over a sputtering hole. His lung collapsed, filling with blood. Something Jacob had said popped into his mind. John taught him how to use the way with a sword. I think it's called cutting things in half. Edward didn't know what to do. That silvery steel had been sticking out of Ditch's back, and when it pulled through, Edward realized something awful. "Oh, you're a murderer! Michael's going to cut your neck off!" He sprinted for the church to tell. Ditch fell to his knees. It was excruciating to breathe. He thought Daniel was about to kill him, or worse, heal him. "If that kid tries to put the hospital on me, I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him in the eye." Daniel sheathed his sword, tears streaming. He didn't know how any of it had happened, but he knew he couldn't face Michael. "I'm a murderer." He wished he could take it all back, or that he could heal Ditch, but he couldn't. He could only run away. Daniel wailed, "I'm sorry," and ran into the stable. Ditch coughed and wheezed, bewildered. "Man, that's messed up." Daniel tore out of there on Sarah, his cloak fluttering behind them. He rode hard and didn't look back, hoping the sailor wouldn't die, that Michael would reach him in time. Heading west out of the clearing, he decided not to use that gate. It was the shortest path to Golgotha. If he had any trouble leaving town, if they somehow managed to catch him, it would happen there. "They'll look for me there, because I'm a murderer." The north gate gave him the same doubts, and he couldn't bear to pass the cauldron, so he turned south on the city streets. Sarah's hooves clashed over the cobblestones like the world was coming to an end. She wasn't the skittish thing she'd been before. Under Daniel's hand, she was a bold charger. People dodged out of the way. Daniel tried not to worry about them. They didn't know what had happened, and wouldn't know to tell anyone they'd seen him, not until he'd escaped from Antioch. The southern guardhouse and watch platform were empty, to his relief, but that gate was much different on the inside than it was on the out. Flowers, old and new, in wreaths and arrangements, leaned against its base like gifts. When he leapt down to lift the bolt, he saw words chiseled into the wood all around. Daniel couldn't read, but as he opened the gate and the arrangements fell over, he began to understand. They left a bouquet on his mother's grave every year on Becca's birthday. Those words were names. They were the names of loved ones lost to the plague. The southern gate had become a memorial. It was Moreau's tombstone. All of those people, they were never coming back. Overcome by his path again, Daniel went to his saddlebag. He took out a rough carving of a pig and left it among the flowers. That is the end of chapter 27. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99 or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for chapter 28, The Third Meridian.